Five masked men slipped through the crowd at Arlington, their eyes locked on the tomb guard, their hands hidden under dark jackets. They moved like wolves, silent, coordinated, ready to strike. The crowd saw only a ceremony, a soldier's steady steps. But those men saw a target. They didn't know who they were challenging. Corporal James Whitaker, the tomb guard, stood motionless, his rifle a perfect line, his gaze fixed on the horizon. To the tourists, he was part of the ritual. To the attackers, he was an obstacle. But what they couldn't see, what no one could guess, was that the man in that pristine uniform had faced death in Afghanistan, carried his dying friend through fire, and made a vow to protect this sacred ground. In 30 seconds, they learned what a tomb guard was truly capable of, and Arlington would never forget. Before we dive into the story, where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. And if you believe that values like honor, courage, and sacrifice still matter, join us in keeping their legacy alive. The October sun hung low over Arlington National Cemetery, Virginia, casting a golden glow across the endless rows of white headstones, each one a silent testament to sacrifice. The air was cool, carrying the faint rustle of autumn leaves and the distant hum of a city that seemed a world away. At the tomb of the unknown soldier, a crowd gathered, their voices hushed in the sacred stillness. Veterans with weathered faces, families pushing wheelchairs, and couples holding hands stood together, drawn to the marble monument that honored those who gave everything without a name. The rhythmic click of a sentinel's heels echoed a heartbeat in the quiet, binding the present to a century of duty. Corporal James Whitaker, 29, a white soldier from Ohio, stood at his post. His uniform was flawless, every crease sharp, every button polished to a mirror shine. His M14 rifle rested at a precise angle across his chest. His boots gleamed, and his eyes stared straight ahead, unyielding as the stone behind him. To the crowd, he was part of the ceremony, a living symbol of discipline. But James was no statue. He was a veteran of Afghanistan, where he'd walked through dust and fire, where he'd lost his closest friend, Sergeant Daniel Carter, to a roadside bomb in Kabul. The explosion had left a scar on his shoulder and a deeper one in his heart. He joined the old guard, endured the grueling training to become a sentinel of the unknown, to keep a promise to Daniel and every soldier whose name was lost to time. Every step, every turn, was an act of devotion, a vow to guard their memory. Among the crowd was Eleanor Davis, 68, a former Army nurse from the Vietnam era. Her hands, steady once in triage tents, now trembled slightly as she gripped her cane, her eyes fixed on James. She saw in him the young soldiers she'd bandaged, the ones who joked through their pain, the ones who never made it home. Beside her stood Walter Hayes, 75, a Marine veteran of the Korean War. His service cap tilted proudly. He'd come to Arlington to honor friends buried here, their faces as clear in his mind as they were 60 years ago. Other visitors, grandparents, veterans, family, stood quietly, some whispering about the tomb's history. Dedicated in 1921 for the unidentified dead of World War I, later expanded for Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. The weight of those wars hung in the air, a shared memory for those who lived through them. But not everyone was there to honor the past. Near the chain barrier, 5 men stood apart, their black masks pulled tight, their eyes cold and calculating. They weren't tourists or mourners. They were dangerous, trained operatives from the Middle East, part of an underground network known to intelligence agencies. Their mission was to strike at this American symbol, to disrupt its sanctity and send a message. Their leader, a tall man with a scar above his mask, scanned the scene with the precision of a predator. His team moved subtly, positioning themselves with military-like coordination, each man covering an angle, each step deliberate. They trained for this, planned every move, and believed they could shatter this sacred place in seconds. James saw them. His eyes didn't move, locked forward as protocol demanded, but his instincts, honed in Afghanistan's valley, screamed. He'd spotted threats before, insurgents blending into markets, their gestures too calculated to be casual. These men were no different. The way they spread out, avoiding the cameras hidden in the stonework, the way their hands stayed close to their jackets, it was the choreography of an ambush. His heart stayed steady, his grip on the rifle firm. The sentinel's code demanded stillness, but his mind was alive, mapping their positions, anticipating their intent. Eleanor noticed them too. She'd seen danger in Vietnam, in the way men moved before violence erupted. Those aren't warners, she thought, her fingers tightening on her cane. Walter caught her glance, his own instincts kicking in. He'd faced ambushes in Korea, knew the look of men with a mission. They're not here for respect, he whispered to Eleanor. They're here for trouble. The crowd remained unaware, caught in the rhythm of James's steps, the solemn beauty of the ceremony. A few veterans murmured about the tomb's history, how it stood for every soldier who never came home. Their stories etched in stone in silence. The attack began with a single, calculated move. The leader stepped forward, letting a handkerchief fall just inside the chain barrier. "Sorry," he said, his voice smooth with a faint accent, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "Drop my handkerchief. Can I grab it?" He didn't wait for an answer. He stepped over the chain, his movements fluid, testing James' resolve. The crowd shifted, some curious, others uneasy. James didn't move, didn't blink. His training held him like steel, but every muscle was coiled, ready for what came next. That was the signal. The other four moved in perfect sync, fanning out to surround James's post. One slipped to his left, another to his right. A third circled behind, and the fourth positioned himself near the crowd, ready to sow chaos. In the control room beneath Arlington's visitor center, Captain Margaret Lee watched the feeds. The cemetery surveillance system, with its facial recognition software, had flagged 2 of the men as known operatives minutes earlier. Priority 1. She said into her headset, her voice steady but urgent. 5 subjects at the tomb, coordinated attack. Immediate action team, deploying now. The leader bent for the handkerchief, then sprang up, a dagger flashing from his sleeve. He lunged, aiming for James's arm to force the rifle from his grip. Simultaneously, the man on the left grabbed for the M14, his fingers brushing the stock. The one behind swung a collapsible baton, aiming for James's spine. The right man delivered a low kick, precise and vicious, meant to topple James. The fifth man shouted in Arabic, a sharp command that sent a ripple of panic through the crowd, his voice designed to scatter and distract. The crowd gasped, some stumbling back, others frozen. Eleanor's heart raced, her cane digging into the ground. Walter's fist clenched, his old Marine instincts urging him to act. But he knew this was James's moment. In those 40 seconds, everything changed. James didn't hesitate. The moment the dagger grazed his rifle, he moved. The sentinel's code allowed defense when the post was threatened, and that line had crossed. With a fluid motion, he swung the butt of his M14, striking the leader's wrist with a crack that echoed across the marble. The dagger flew, skittering across the stone, and the leader staggered back, clutching his arm. The man grabbing for the rifle was next. James pivoted, driving his elbow into the man's chest with a force that sent him sprawling, gasping for air. The baton from behind came close, grazing his shoulder, leaving a sting he barely felt. James shifted his weight, using the attacker's momentum to throw him off balance, sending him crashing to the ground with a thud. The kicker was faster, his legs slicing through the air. But James read the move. He sidestepped, letting his momentum carry him forward, then hooked his boot behind the attacker's knee, dropping him to the marble. The fifth man, still shouting, rushed forward, a small blade glinting in his hand. James met him head-on, using a controlled shoulder check to send him sprawling, the blade clattering away. Each move was precise, economical, born of years in combat zones where hesitation meant death. James had carried wounded men through firefights, held positions under mortar barges, and learned that survival demanded clarity under pressure. These men were trained, dangerous, but James was something more, a soldier forged in loss, standing for those who couldn't. The crowd was a blur of motion and sound. A woman screamed, pulling her husband back. A veteran in a wheelchair gripped the arms of his chair, his eyes wide. Eleanor stood rooted, her breath shallow, seeing in James the soldier she tended in Vietnam, men who fought not for glory, but for duty. Walter's voice was low, almost reverent. "That's training," he muttered. That's what it takes. In the control room, Captain Lee's screen showed every angle. The system had tracked the men's movements, their coordinated approach triggering alerts before the first move. Immediate action team 10 seconds out, she said, her fingers steady on the console. She'd seen threats before, but the speed of this attack was chilling. The immediate action team burst through a side gate. 4 officers in tactical gear, moving with lethal efficiency. They were on the attackers before the crowd could fully react. The leader, still clutching his wrists, was zip-tied in seconds. The man with the baton tried to crawl away, but was pinned to the ground. The kicker and the rifle grabber offered no resistance, their confidence shattered. The fifth man, the shouter, tried to bolt, his mask slipping as he ran. An officer tackled him near the chain barrier, the impact sending a collective gasp through the crowd. From the first step over the chain to the last zip tie, 40 seconds had passed. 40 seconds, and James Whitaker had held the line. James returned to his post. His uniform was scuffed, a thin cut on his hand where the dagger had grazed him, a bruise forming on his shoulder from the baton. But his rifle was back at its perfect angle, his boots planted exactly where they'd been. His face was calm, his eyes fixed on the horizon, as if nothing had happened. To the crowd, he was the same sentinel, but now they saw the truth. He wasn't just a figure in a ceremony, he was a soldier, a guardian of the fallen, a man who'd faced 5 trained attackers and never faltered. The silence that followed was profound, the kind that settles over a battlefield or a cathedral when history shifts. Eleanor's eyes glistened not with fear, but with pride. She'd seen soldiers like James in the chaos of war, holding ground when hope seemed lost. She stepped forward, her cane tapping softly, and placed a single white rose at the base of the chain barrier. "For my husband, and for you, young man." She looked at James, knowing he couldn't respond but feeling a connection that needed no words. Walter watched, his jaw tight, then turned to a group of veterans nearby. "That boy's got the heart of every soldier buried here," he said, gesturing to the sea of headstones. He stood for them all. The crowd began to murmur, their voices soft but heavy with meaning. A man in a navy cap, his hands scarred from years at sea, spoke to his wife. "Did you see how he moved? Not a step wasted, like he was born for it." His wife nodded, her eyes still on James. "That's what they don't teach you in books," she said. "That's duty." A woman in her 70s, her hair pinned neatly under a scarf, clutched her purse, remembering her brother who died in Vietnam. She'd come to Arlington every year, but today felt different. Today, she'd seen the tomb defended, not just by ceremony, but by courage. The attackers were led away, their masks removed, revealing faces hardened by years of conflict, but softened now by defeat. The fifth man, the one who'd shouted, sat in the security van, his head bowed. "We didn't know," he said, his voice barely audible. "We thought it was just a monument." The officer securing him didn't respond. But Eleanor, standing nearby, overheard. She shook her head, her voice steady despite her age. "It's never just a monument," she said. "It's every boy who didn't come home. It's why he stood there." The man looked at her, his eyes flickering with something like shame, and said, "No more." Captain Lee in the control room reviewed the footage. The system had worked flawlessly, identifying 2 of the men as operatives linked to a network active in Europe and the Middle East. Their plan had been to disrupt the tomb, to film the chaos and spread it online, a strike at America's heart. But they hadn't counted on James Whitaker. They hadn't counted on a soldier who'd seen worse, who'd carried his wounded friend through a firefight, who'd made a promise he'd never break. Lee leaned back, her voice quiet. She said, "Good work, Corporal," to the empty room. The story of that afternoon spread not through fleeting posts or viral videos, but through the conversations of those who'd been there, at veterans halls and church basements, over coffee at VFW posts. People spoke of the sentinel who'd faced 5 dangerous men and held his ground. They talked about the tomb, about what it meant to guard the unknown, to stand for those who had no voice. A group of veterans in Ohio, James' home state, organized a bus trip to Arlington, bringing their families to see the place where duty met danger. A woman in Virginia wrote a letter to her local paper, urging readers to visit the tomb to understand what it stood for. In a small town in Pennsylvania, a retired teacher began a lecture series on the history of Arlington, starting with the story of James Whitaker. James didn't hear these stories. He didn't need to. As the sun sank, casting long shadows across the marble, he completed his shift. His steps were as precise as ever, his rifle steady. The cut on his hand stung, the bruise on his shoulder ached, but his breathing was even, his focus unbroken. He thought of Daniel, of the laughter they'd shared in the barracks, of the silence that followed the explosion. He thought of the tomb, of the soldiers it honored, their names lost, but their sacrifice eternal. This was why he stood here, why he'd fought, why he'd returned to his post without a word. Walter lingered as the crowd dispersed, his eyes on James. He raised a hand in a slow, deliberate salute, Marine to soldier across decades of service. James couldn't return it, not while on duty, but his eyes flicked toward the old man for a moment, a silent acknowledgement. It was enough. Eleanor stayed too, her rose still resting against the chain. She thought of her husband, of the soldier she tended, of the young man who'd stood so still and fought so fiercely. "We don't forget," she whispered, to no one and everyone. This story isn't just about James Whitaker or the 5 men who tried to desecrate a sacred place. It's about every soldier who stood guard, every family who's grieved, every person who's paused at a headstone and felt the weight of history. It's about the promise we make to remember, to honor, to protect. So I ask you, have you been to Arlington? Have you stood before the tomb and felt its silence? Have you told your children, your grandchildren, about the soldiers who gave everything? Share this story with them. Bring them to this place. Let them see what duty looks like, what sacrifice means. Because as long as we remember, as long as we stand ready, those who gave their lives will never be unknown.